Welcome back to the MOOC course titled Qualitative Research Methods. My name is Aradhana Malik and I'm helping you with this course. And we have discussed what qualitative research is. We've discussed paradigms. We have discussed different things. This session onwards, we are going to talk about actual strategies of inquiry. Using or actual strategies of inquiry in qualitative research. So we'll start with ethnography. What is ethnography? Ethnography is the process and product of describing and interpreting cultural behavior. Let's dwell on this for a little bit. It is the process of describing cultural behavior, and it's also the product of describing and interpreting cultural behavior. The process itself becomes a finished product. It adds to the finished product. Ethnos, a Greek term, denotes a people, a race, or a cultural group. When ethno as a prefix is combined with graphic to form the term ethnographic or ethnographic, the reference is to the subdiscipline known as the descriptive anthropology in its broadest sense, the science devoted to describing ways of life of humankind. So it is a science of describing how human beings live. Ethnography is the science of describing how human beings live and how they be, how they do what they do, how they exist. Ethnography then refers to a social scientific description of a people and the cultural basis of their peoplehood. The cultural reasons, the cultural foundations of a group of people. When we say a people, we are not making a grammatical mistake here. We are referring to a group, a community, a gathering, a bracket, a cluster of people. So when we talk about ethnography, we are talking about a social scientific description of a people and what it is that helps them be identified as members of the same cultural group. What they do, what they have, how they live, how they exist. All of that, descriptions of all of that constitute the field of ethnography. Some genres of ethnography. How do we study ethnography? What ethnography is? Some different types of ethnography are. The first and the most commonly known genre that we are going to discuss here is called biography. Biography or life history. The aim of biography or a biography is to illuminate cultural, historical and social facts rather than individual lives or aspects of personality. So we describe the social facts of life, we describe cultural aspects of life rather than individual lives. We don't pick one person, we say this is how it is going to be for the entire community, and the voice or the method or the approach that we use here is known as synecdoche. And synecdoche is a rhetorical figure in which a representative individual is selected and made to stand for an entire culture. So we take a representative, we describe the representative figure's life, and we say that because this one person is like this, everybody is going to be like this. Now this has its own flaws. Immediately you will say, well, one person cannot be, you just said that everybody is unique, everybody is behaving in different ways. How can we take a representative? We take the things, the aspects of life that can be applied to a larger population, and we describe those in detail. So we say this is not atypical, but this is one typical individual representative of the group. So instead of going through the lives of every single member of that group and then drawing parallels and then drawing categories and saying 100 people feel this way, so this is how it's going to be, we just take one typical person, we describe the whole life of that person, or not the whole life, but then a slice of life or a behavior or a phenomenon in using that one individual as a representative of that group of people, and then we say that this is representative, not exactly the same, but a representation of how different members in the group would do it. For example, let's take the example of how babies' births are celebrated. What happens in a community when a woman discovers that she is going to have a baby? Then what are the processes, what are the rituals that are followed to welcome this new life into the world? So what happens in some cultures? There are prayers are offered. Some prayers are offered when the mother, the new mother, discovers that she is going to have a baby. In some communities, as soon as the woman discovers that she is going to have a baby, she is not supposed to tell anyone outside of the people who are going to take care of her. So her doctor, her immediate family members. Immediate family doesn't mean extended family till the first trimester is up, because and I think the reason for this is the high rate of infant mortality or prenatal mortality, abortions. So accidental, to minimize the impact of accidental abortions, people don't tell others that they're going to have a baby, and it's a cultural thing. Only when that critical phase of the first trimester has passed do people then inform others, and then celebrations happen. And then in the 7th month, in many communities, 7th or 8th month, you have something similar to what is called as a baby shower. So we have different communities here in India call it different things, and the new mother is prepared for the baby to come, and she's given tips, and she's treated really well to prepare her for the arrival of the new life. So this whole process of welcoming the new life could be described by taking the life of one woman within a community, studying every ritual, every custom in detail, and with the inputs of the elders within that family. Just taking this one example, a biography could be written and to explain what really happens to welcome this new life into the world and to prepare the new mother to deal with her upcoming responsibilities. So so this is biography or life history, a slice of life that is, it's different from case study. We'll talk about case study another time, but then this is what a biography would look like. Or you study one aspect, a larger sized phenomenon. This is a slice of life, but then you study the whole every aspect of that phenomenon from different angles, and you say that more or less different people within the same culture would follow the same practices for this. So okay, memoir, on the other hand, is a personal document in which the author takes the reader back to a corner of the author's own life in the field that was unusually vivid, full of affect, or framed by unique events. So a memoir is a personal document in which the author takes the reader back to a corner of the author's own life in the field that was unusually vivid, full of affect or emotion, or framed by unique events. So maybe a traumatic experience. For example, to find out how people were affected by, say, something serious like an earthquake. We recently had an earthquake in New Zealand. What happened? How did people deal with the aftermath? What did people experience? Now something like that can be documented in the form of a memoir. Extremely traumatic, somebody is standing in the doorway, roof falls down, the person is standing on the roof of a building and the building collapses suddenly and the person falls down, or whatever. I mean, various things happen when there's an earthquake. So that whole experience can be captured in the form of a memoir, and depending on the intensity of the trauma, depending on what the person experienced, it can be summed up in the form of a memoir. Or during civil strife, for lack of a more recent example, I can tell you that I've heard so many stories, and there are several projects going on worldwide to capture stories of things like the Indo-Pak partition, of events like the Indo-Pak partition, And individual memoirs constitute pieces of history. What happened to you? What happened to your life at that point? Or maybe the Holocaust, or maybe the civil strife in other parts of the world. So, so all of this, or how local people have been affected because of the war in Iraq, or how girls' lives have changed because of Malala Yousafzai's stand to protect her right to education. So, these personal incidents that take you back into a social phenomenon, and you describe it very, very vividly in order to add to the body of knowledge. Okay, so that is called a memoir. Now, it may be documented under a pseudonym, under a false name, and the reasons for these memoirs to be documented under pseudonyms are: first is distancing oneself from the actual event helps with healing. Excuse me. Revisiting a traumatic event is painful for anyone, and the first thing we learn in any research on human behavior is to protect the rights, to protect the welfare of the subjects under study. Okay, and many research studies don't really take care of this, but I was trained like that, so I'm going to share this with you. Whenever you are approaching any human subject for any kind of research, please make sure that whatever you do does not disturb the person so much that it's impossible to go back to the original healed state. And this is critical when people go through traumatic events, and we'll discuss this more when we talk about the ethics of research. When people go through traumatic events excuse me, sometimes venting helps, sometimes just forgetting about the traumatic event helps. And I know that my colleagues in the field of counseling and psychiatry may disagree with me, but then people react differently to different kinds of trauma. They deal with trauma differently. Dealing with trauma does not always involve speaking about it to an unknown person. Dealing with trauma could also involve creating new memories within the same space and overwriting those painful memories. So whenever we write down, some people just write it and get it out of their system, and then they burn that piece of paper. Even that seems to help. So they vent and then they let go. They may not want to share these details with somebody else, with a counselor, with a stranger, with a researcher. So as researchers, as hard pressed as we are to go back to get stories, to get personal inputs on whatever it is that we are studying from people who have actually gone through those traumatic events, we must find out what it is that the participants want. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people write down personal memoirs using pseudonyms. They don't want people to identify them. They don't want people to point out and say, oh, I'm sorry that you went through something difficult like this. No. But they would like to get it out of their system, so they'll just write a story about it and get it out of their system. Distancing oneself and still venting gives a person a chance to heal. Distancing also may enhance perceived objectivity when you write from the perspective of an outsider, from the perspective of a third person, but because you have gone through that experience yourself, you can pull out the intricacies of that event from your own personal experience, but you write it under a pseudonym. So when you see things as a third person who has felt it, so has deeper understanding of it, it is supposed to, or there is some enhanced objectivity associated with it. It also enhances readability and publishability for general readership. It's not only me, I went through this, I went through that, etc. No, it's not that. It's anybody in that situation. It could be me, it could be you, it could be a third person. Anybody in that situation could have experienced whatever I experienced. So you don't write your name, you write somebody else's name, so people can relate to it. So it enhances the chances of whatever you're writing to be published and to be accepted by a wider group of people. to be read, to be acknowledged by a wider readership. And that is one more way of describing the experiences that one went through. We are talking about social phenomena. We are not talking about replicability of data for the sole purpose of prediction. We are talking about descriptions of unique, extremely unusually vivid, very emotional phenomena that highlight some event that does not have a very high chance of being repeated. So this is the other end of the spectrum. The next genre is narrative ethnography. And narrative ethnography, what narrative ethnography does is it helps overlap memoirs and life histories. So you describe the life history, but you also put yourself in it. It is created when individuals attempt to portray accurately the subjects of biographies, but also to include their own experience in the text. So it's not a pseudonymic memoir. It is not purely a biography, a third person account of somebody else's life. It is somewhere between the two. Okay. Ethnographic critical theory is an extension of narrative ethnography. It intertwines the position of the self within the context of the other in order to explain and emphasize why and how studying the self can explain the tensions experienced by the general population. So critical theory stems from a need to highlight, we discussed this earlier, to highlight the tensions experienced by a group of people who are possibly disadvantaged. And when we put ourselves in that situation, we are able to explain these tensions in a much clearer, much more thorough manner than we are from the perspective of a total outsider. So that is what narrative ethnographic critical theory does. It's an extension of narrative ethnography. Okay. Some more genres are fictive genres. You could write short stories. Lots of stories have been written about what happened during the Indo-Pak partition. Movies have been enacted. You have novellas, you have plays, etc. Or you could write diaries or travel logs. I went there, I did this, I did that, etc. So these are some more genres of ethnography where people describe things. A very nice, very heartfelt book that comes to mind about the Indo-Pak partition is Tamas by Bhisham Sahni. And amazing book, very painful, and there was a TV series made on it. And so people who have gone through partition can relate to whatever happened. Or there was a recent movie called Pinjar, recent meaning about 10-12 years back. And even that captured the essence of the Indo-Pak partition beautifully. Another book was Train to Pakistan by Khushwant Singh. So I mean, there are so many examples of these fictive genres. Then diaries or travel logs are very, very good, very reliable sources of ethnographic data. So these are some more ways of capturing real life data from real life situations and in their dynamic, complex, chaotic forms. Okay. The bottom line here is that the self and the other are vulnerable experiencing subjects working to co-produce knowledge. As researchers, we are not different, we are not totally distanced from the subject under study. We are connected and we together create knowledge. We don't create knowledge independently of each other. We don't let the phenomenon continue. The phenomenon, once the phenomenon knows that it's being observed, the phenomenon changes. The observer, as distanced as one might want to be, the observer gets connected with the observed, and together, in and through this connection, a new set of knowledge is created, and that is the bottom line in ethnographic research. The observer and observed are not entirely separate categories. We can try and distance ourselves, we can try and be as objective as we want, but we are going to be influencing each other, so we have to go with that assumption. Experience is intersubjective and embodied, not individual and fixed, but social and processual. It is not fixed in time, it is not an individual phenomenon, it is a phenomenon that is dynamic, it is happening in connection with everybody else that is in the environment, in connection with everything else in the environment that is constantly changing. Anyone who has had any training in qualitative research, who has studied qualitative research and used qualitative research methods can tell you that it's just impossible to capture, at least at this point in time. Now I'll have to qualify my statements. At this point in time, it is impossible to capture any slice of life, you know, honestly saying that it's static in time and space. No, everything is moving. So that slice of life, and then that phenomenon will not be or is not likely to be the same the next time you study it. So everything is you know, experience is embodied. Experience comes out of people. People are the ones who are doing this experience, and it's not individual, it is social, and it is in and through the process. And as processes change, as human beings evolve, as experience, as we move on in life, the experience changes, and the description of the experience also should change. Intersubjectivity and dialogue involve situations where bodies marked by the social, that is by difference, may be presented as partial identities. Intersubjectivity and dialogue. So we are constantly, you know, involve situations where bodies marked by the social. When we talk about the social, we are talking about differences. We are talking about different genders, we are talking about different ethnicities, we are talking about different races, we are talking about different age, we are talking about different communities, different cultures, different ways of behavior. Everything that is influencing you is going to play out in your experience, and that is going to affect what is being studied and how it is being studied. Okay. And when we talk about dialogue, we are talking about dialogue within these situations where these differences may be presented as partial identities. So the identity of a person cannot be captured in toto. The identity is only partial and is constantly changing, is constantly evolving as a result of its interactions with its environment. The experience of being anyone can never be singular. It will always be dependent on a multiplicity of locations and positions that are socially constructed. The experience of being. These positionings are different for each individual as well as for each culture that ethnographers come into contact with as field workers, observant participants, and collectors of life stories. So these positionings, different positions that people place themselves in, change when ethnographers, you know, come into contact with different cultures, and how you place these different positions changes. Theory is not a transparent culture-free zone, not a duty-free intellectual marketplace hovering between cultures, lacking all connection to embodied lived experience. Theory comes from lived experience, and lived experience is constantly changing and being affected by everything around it. Writing for and about the community in which one has grown up and lived, or at least achieved some degree of insider status, should produce engaged writing centering on the ongoing dialectical, political, personal relationship between the self and the other. And that is really the bottom line of ethnographic research. We are talking about representing the connection between the self and the other, representing the connection between the observer and the observed within the dialectical tensions between the political, personal relationship between the myself and the other. So we are essentially talking about capturing reality as it happens from the perspective of the observer and the observed, from the perspective of the relationship between the observer and the observed, and how this affects the reality that is taking place, and how the reality that is taking place affects this relationship between the observer and the observed. Very complicated, but this is what it really is. Real life is complex, it's chaotic, it is crazy, for want of a better word, or to oversimplify it. Real life is very complex, and that is what the complexity of real life is, what ethnography tries to capture through its various strategies. So that is all we have time for in this class. We will continue in the next class. Thank you very much for listening.